On December 16, 1944, Nazi Germany launched its final major counteroffensive of the Second World War. Hoping to recreate the lightning triumph of 1940 by sending armored spearheads crashing through the Allied lines in the Ardennes and bursting out toward the coast. By 1944, the map of Europe had changed color almost completely. In the west, the Allies, having broken out of Normandy, were closing in on Germany's borders. In the east, the Soviet Red Army had annihilated Army Group Center during Operation Bastogne, one of the greatest disasters ever suffered by the Wehrmacht. In the south, British and American forces were pushing upward through Italy, tightening the noose. And above all, these strategic bombers were burning down what little remained of Germany's industrial heart. This was no longer a war that Germany was shaping. It was a war Germany was struggling to survive. Amid that reality, exhaustion showed itself day by day. Fuel was nearly gone. Supplies were collapsing, manpower losses were so severe that the army had to patch its ranks with inexperienced replacements. But instead of accepting a defensive posture, Hitler convinced himself that a single powerful counterblow could split the Americans and the British, forcing them to the negotiating table. That belief produced Watch on the Rhine, a daring plan to smash through the American lines along a 60-mile stretch of the Ardennes, where only 6 thinly spread divisions were holding the front. Hitler committed 3 entire armies, the 6th SS Panzer Army striking toward Antwerp, the 5th Panzer Army driving into Brussels, and the 7th Army shielding the southern flank. If Antwerp fell, Germany could sever the Allied coalition in 2. But could this gamble really reverse a collapsing war? By 1944, the global map of the war had almost completely changed color. In the west, after breaking through the Normandy lines, the Allied forces were advancing rapidly all the way to Germany's borders. In the east, the Soviets had obliterated Army Group Center in Operation Bastogne, pushing the Germans back hundreds of kilometers. From the south, Allied troops were closing in on the Alps after fighting their way through Italy. Meanwhile, back in the homeland, German cities and factories were being hammered by relentless bombing raids, leaving an already weakened war industry on the brink of collapse. Germany lacked fuel, lacked vehicles, lacked manpower, and most critically, it lacked time. In the middle of this bleak reality, Hitler still believed in one final opportunity. He was convinced that the bond between the United States and Britain was far more fragile than most assumed, and that a single powerful strike in Western Europe could shake the entire Allied coalition. That is why he rejected every defensive proposal, and demanded a full-scale offensive through the Ardennes, where only a few thinly spread American divisions held the line. Thus, Watch on the Rhine took shape with three major German armies, driving their spearheads toward Antwerp in an effort to cut the Allied forces in half, where deep divisions within the German High Command began to surface. Inside the German High Command, the Ardennes counteroffensive was fractured even before it began. Rundstedt and Model, the two most seasoned field marshals Germany had left, warned bluntly that the Wehrmacht no longer had the strength to cross the Meuse, that such a deep thrust would turn into a steel trap that would see the entire force squeezed to destruction, and that Germany's already broken logistics would collapse long before the tanks ever reached Antwerp. But Hitler dismissed every warning. He believed that one bold strike was enough to turn the tide. Reality, however, told a different story. Germany had lost more than 3.5 million soldiers since the war began, forcing the army to recruit 16-year-old boys and 60-year-old men alike. The Navy and Air Force were stripped of personnel just to plug the gaps in the infantry. Newly formed Volksgrenadier divisions lacked training, lacked equipment, and lacked any real combat experience. To compensate for those weaknesses, the German leadership pulled elite formations from the Eastern Front, from SS Panzer units to armored regiments, along with the last remaining Tiger Deus, TuS Panthers and StuGs. But even with such hardened spearheads, Germany still needed a psychological blow to unsettle the enemy. That was when the plan to sow chaos behind Allied lines took shape, with Otto Skorzeny commanding a force disguised as American troops to spread confusion and disorder. In total, more than 300,000 soldiers, 100 tanks, and 900 artillery pieces were mobilized, a massive effort, but also a clear sign that Germany was throwing everything it had left into this final gamble. Throughout the entire plan, Germany faced three life-or-death constraints: the sky's fuel and the weather. In the air, the Allies held absolute superiority. Only when thick cloud cover and freezing fog blanketed the Ardennes were American and British aircraft temporarily grounded, allowing German convoys to move without fear of being spotted from above. But that advantage would last only briefly. The far greater problem lay in Germany's own reserves. The entire force had roughly 5 million gallons of fuel, barely enough for 6 days of operations. To push farther, the Germans had to rely on something nearly impossible: capturing American supply depots intact, and at exactly the right moment. Even the operational timetable revealed how unrealistic the plan was. Seize St Vith and Bastogne by day 2, cross the Meuse by day 4, and then charge straight toward Antwerp. Could any army in late 1944 achieve such objectives? Germany was betting everything on surprise: the dense Ardennes forest, its ridgelines and hills, and the thick fog that blinded Allied reconnaissance. That secrecy did give them the advantage in the opening hours. But that fragile edge could not last, and when German troops finally collided with the first American defensive lines, the real battle, the decisive core of the entire operation, was only just beginning. Before dawn could even break on December 16th, the Ardennes front shook under 90 minutes of relentless artillery fire, the opening act of Germany's largest offensive on the Western Front. More than 200,000 German troops surged forward, overwhelming barely 80,000 Americans, stretched thin across a fragile defensive line. In those first hours, the Allies were unable to put aircraft into the sky, handing the Germans a precious early advantage. Yet at the very moment when everything seemed on the brink of collapse, 3 American anchors held the front together. Elsenborn Ridge stood firm against the SS armored thrusts. St Vith held out for 5 full days, shattering Hitler's bold timetable. And Bastogne, encircled but unbroken, was defended by the 101st Airborne and the 10th Armored Division, with everything they had. The American defensive mindset was no longer about holding ground for its own sake. They held junctions, roads, and bridges points, which if lost, would unravel the entire line. Every hour they delayed, the Germans bought another hour for reinforcements to arrive. And by Christmas, nearly 500,000 Allied troops from multiple nations had entered the battle. On December 19th, Eisenhower handed command of the northern sector to Montgomery, while the British 30th Division was positioned to safeguard the Meuse River. But even with the forward line stabilized, the greatest trials were still ahead: the brutal winter and the tightening fuel crisis that was beginning to strangle both sides. As Germany's spearheads were stopped at Elsenborn, St Vith, and Bastogne, a harsh truth began to reveal itself. The tactics might have been bold, but logistics were what truly determined victory or defeat. And it was here that the Ardennes offensive fell into a downward spiral from which Germany could not escape. The fuel reserves on which Hitler had staked the entire campaign crumbled almost from the start. The American fuel depots, Germany's critical objective, had mostly been destroyed or evacuated, in time leaving the Germans unable to capture even a fraction of what they needed. On the narrow Ardennes roads, long columns of German trucks were trapped for hours in deep snow and chaotic traffic. An armored army without fuel is little more than a predator stripped of its fangs. The Americans, meanwhile, had the Red Ball Express. Its drivers, many of them African-American soldiers, worked around the clock hauling fuel and supplies day and night. That quiet, relentless effort knocked the foundation out from under Germany's entire plan. And then the winter of 1944-45 came down like a freezing blade. Temperatures around 7 degrees ice drained the strength of both sides. Many American soldiers had only thin summer uniforms, shivering in the cold, yet refusing to yield. Stories like that of Lieutenant Ben Rugg, wounded yet still leading his men to retake Burdorf, remind us that in the throat of the storm, sometimes human will can endure longer than steel. When the bitter winter seemed to have sealed the skies shut, the clouds finally broke on December 23rd, and sunlight returned. This was the moment that turned the entire campaign. Within hours, Allied aircraft surged over the Ardennes, striking German convoys, destroying armor, and severing the lifelines the Wehrmacht was desperately clinging to. And over the besieged town of Bastogne, the first supply drops landed fresh breath for the American forces who had been surrounded for days. From a position of pressure and desperation, the balance began to shift. But the reversal came not only from the air. On the ground, General George S. Patton executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers of World War II. His Third Army had been preparing to attack Saar, yet within just 48 to 8 hours, the entire formation pivoted 90 degrees and charged north. By December 26th, they had opened the corridor into Bastogne, breaking the encirclement and halting Germany's momentum. From that point forward, Germany had only one option: hold on. But attritional warfare was exactly what they could no longer sustain. Every tank lost was gone forever. Every depleted unit was one they could not replace. Meanwhile, the Allies, despite suffering losses, could reorganize and rebuild with speed. Germany's last two efforts, Operation Baseplate and Operation Nordwind, only worsened their situation. One depleted their veteran pilots, the other failed in Alsace-Lorraine. By the end of January 1945, the Ardennes Bulge was completely sealed. The front line returned to where it had been, but the strategic landscape had changed entirely. From this moment on, the road into Germany was open. As the German thrust collapsed under pressure from both sky and ground, the entire course of the campaign reversed. From this point on, we enter the final act of the Ardennes, an ending that had become inevitable. The consequences were devastating. Germany lost between 80,000 and 100,000 troops, while the Allies suffered roughly 75,000 casualties. But the difference lay in one simple fact: the Allies could replace their losses, Germany could not. During the fighting, numerous massacres of prisoners of war and civilians occurred at Malmedy, Wereth, Chenogne, and several small Belgian villages' psychological wounds that are still remembered today. Why did Germany fail? They could not cross the Meuse. Their timetable was pure fantasy. Their fuel reserves collapsed. And once the skies cleared, Allied air power ruled absolutely. More importantly, American forces fought with resilience, flexibility, and denied the Germans any space to maneuver. The Ardennes offensive was in truth Hitler's final gamble, a desperate throw that consumed Germany's last real reserves and left both the eastern and western fronts fatally weakened. In January 1945, the Soviets launched a massive offensive. By March, the Allies had crossed the Rhine, and only a few months later, the war in Europe reached its end.